Hello and welcome to Dialogue. U.S. President Donald Trump has dramatically escalated pressure on Russia this week to end its attacks against Ukraine. The moves include announcing new weapons to Kiev and threatening direct and secondary tariffs on Moscow and those who do business with it if peace isn't reached in 50 days. What has caused this U-turn on Trump's stance on the conflict? What could be Russia's response as more European countries join the U.S. scheme to ship weapons to Ukraine? And how will these moves impact the situation in the battlefield? Join us for our discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Zhou Bo, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Security and Strategy, Tsinghua University, and Ruslan Bortnik, Director of the Ukrainian Institute of Politics, and Anton Fedyashin, Associate Professor at American University. Welcome to Dialogue. So, Anton, I will start with you. Obviously, we are seeing President Trump changing his stance on the Ukraine conflict, now promising to support weapons to Ukraine. And tell us more about, what caused his change of stance here?
Shenhua, I'm not sure, to be honest with you, how much of a change of a stance this is. I know that this is the subject and the narrative in many Western and also in Ukrainian media, which is understandable from the point of view of Ukraine. But let's look at strategically, before we get into the weeds of things, let's look strategically at what has happened. First of all, the United States has been supplying Ukraine with weapons for the past 3.5 years. And although there were very short, brief, discrete interruptions under President Trump, nothing fundamental has changed. The only thing that has changed with the announcement that came out of the White House from President Trump is that the United States will no longer be supplying Ukraine with free weapons. It will continue to supply it with weapons that the Europeans will be expected to pay for. That doesn't sound to me like a fundamental shift. It sounds less pro-Ukrainian, by the way, than what the initial reports have made it sounded like being. It sounds like the Trump administration wants to stop paying for the weapons that are going into Ukraine, and it will continue to supply American weapons as long as they are paid for by someone else. Let's just remember that the Biden administration was sending weapons to Ukraine for free, essentially. In other words, the U.S. had already paid for them, and then they were shipped to Ukraine. This is not a fundamental change. Now, Trump seems to be annoyed with President Putin. That is true. He has said so. But he said so many things on so many occasions and then reversed or qualified himself that we'll have to wait for a week or two to see where he lands eventually, and then expect him to change again, by the way.
Ruslan, given how Trump treated President Zelensky, some time ago, not long that ago, so I would say this is a welcome gesture for Kiev. After all, people are concerned or were concerned with, whether Trump government will continue to support weapons to Ukrainian side, right?
Nothing personal, just a business, and in politics, this is a main approach on treating different things. And I think the different statements from the Trump side towards Zelensky depended on the time and on the phase of Ukrainian-United States negotiation. I want to remind you that Ukraine signed a mineral deal with United States, and after it, the rhetoric from the Trump side toward Ukraine, the Ukrainian leader, changed significantly. Trump doesn't demand to make a new election in Ukraine. Trump stopped criticize a lot of Ukrainian government. And moreover, that wing, left or right wing inside of Trump team, which is strictly against Ukraine and Ukrainian leader. We are talking about the Elon Musk, Tucker Carlson, and other persons. Now they are out of the team, and this it's also make a significant change and influence on the situation. But adding to your previous question, I want to say that maybe I'm some disagree with my colleague, because I see a significant change in Trump's policy toward Ukraine, because previous United States administrations sent to Ukraine different supplies for the sum of from 100 billion United States dollars till 350 billion United States dollars. And the new deal between the United States and NATO about supplying to Ukraine the weapon means that the United States is not going to continue this supplying for free. United States is trying to make a distance from this war, from this conflict. United States is no more the participant of this war. The United States is no more the ally of Ukraine or this war, but the United States is still a partner of a trade, military trade in this war for Ukraine, and United States still a guarantee for European countries which are belonging to NATO from the point of their security, but not Ukrainian security. Moreover, this question about the sanctions toward Russia, it's also so kind of approach to take a pause. 50 days is very long term, to take a pause and to don't make any decisions right now on Russia and Ukraine. It's a part of new United States strategy to look as kids are fighting in the park in the time when these kids are not ready to stop this fight, until the end, after the some time go back like an arbiter or judge in this situation.
Well, Zhou Bo, Trump appeared to be frustrated with the lack of a ceasefire or a commitment to ceasefire from the Russian side. I don't think he's also completely satisfied with the stance from Kiev towards that kind of situation. He expected a quick ceasefire, a quick peace deal, even between the two sides. But obviously, he's not getting that. So that's why he's applying heavy pressure probably on Moscow.
Oh, I think so, because he actually have made a joke of himself by declaring that he would be able to resolve this issue within 24 hours. But right now we see the reality, right? Well, if I put myself in the shoes of President Putin, I believe that he has made it quite clear that what he wants, right? First of all, these four regions have already been written into Russian constitution as Russian territory. So if he could not eventually fully control these four regions, actually it would be a disgrace. Yeah. The only question is to what extent. So that is why the Russian soldiers have to fight very, very hard. But the result is last year they actually haven't made much headway. The new territory they have occupied is just 1%. And this year, we have already, 6 months passed. Actually, they haven't made new progress either. But I believe it will be precise because of that. So the Russians would become more desperate, trying to, to have more gains in the battlefield. And even if this is over, it's not over, because then we have a problem of what Putin said. The root cause. Yeah, the root cause then is NATO expansion. On one hand, NATO is certainly right that they have not forced any countries to join NATO. So that is why they believe that Putin's allegation is bullshit. But on the other hand, from even Soviet time, that started from Mikhail Gorbachev down to Boris Yeltsin and to President Putin. What is common among these three people? That is, they are all against the NATO expansion. So this is really, really complicated. And so that is what they describe as indivisible security, in Europe.
Yeah, it's just more than, of course, itself is too complicated probably for Trump anyway. Back to Anton, you talk about, you have doubts whether he changed or not. But anyway, look at that, Financial Times report, Trump privately asked Zelensky, whether he could strike Moscow if the US provided long-range weapons. He did not deny the report. But he said to reporters, Kiev shouldn't strike Moscow. But what's his true idea? Is he supportive of striking, as far as Moscow, or he's against that?
Tsinghua, I can't speak to the veracity of this report. I'm 50 years old, and in my fairly short lifetime, I've lived, as we all have on this program, through so many reports in both Western and non-Western media that turn out to be absolutely untrue or partially untrue, that it's difficult to comment on this seriously. If Trump had asked Zelensky to strike Moscow, and Zelensky could have done it, he would have done it, because the Ukrainians have struck Moscow on multiple occasions, and they've tried even more often than they've actually succeeded, because the Russians keep blowing up unmanned aerial vehicles as they approach Moscow. So none of this is particular news. The difference here, the important part here, is whether the missiles that are used to strike Moscow are actual American missiles guided by American specialists with American satellites. And that hasn't happened yet. If it should happen, then the Russians will be faced with the question of whether to retaliate against an American military facility. And that will simply escalate the conflict. I don't know whether this report is accurate. We don't know if Trump actually said so. His administration started walking back the claims without openly denying them. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, the truth on the battlefield right now, however, is that the Russians are remorselessly gaining ground and dealing blows to the Ukrainian army. They're also taking losses themselves. That's to be expected in a war, but time, unfortunately for Ukraine again, is not on Ukraine's side. So the question is, this 50-day period, regardless of whether there are or aren't strikes against Moscow or St. Petersburg, is this ultimately working against Russia or against Ukraine? And given that the Russians are treating this as a war of attrition, which is why they're not conducting big aero offensives, and they're not leaping to seize big cities. They're slowly surrounding them, and they've been successful at doing this ever since they defeated the Ukrainian summer counteroffensive of 2023. From all of this, time seems to be on Russia's side, because unfortunately for Ukraine again, if you're in a war of attrition, the Russians have the greater resources, both demographically and economically and militarily so far. We'll see what difference this U.S. weapons sold to NATO and sent to Ukraine will make. But look, to be honest with you, the Ukrainians and the Europeans didn't need this announcement in the White House. They could have been sending Ukraine all the weapons that they could have sent to Ukraine over the past 3.5 years. The truth is that even the West is facing a capacity problem. It's not producing enough artillery shells, even enough drones or missiles, let alone tanks and guns, to really make a difference on the battlefield. So it comes down to the question of diplomacy ultimately.
But the related question, Anton, would be what kind of weapons Trump is going to supply to NATO? Does that include like long-range missiles or?
Tsinghua, that's a great question, and it is interesting that we have not heard any of those specifics. We also haven't heard the specifics about this deal that we heard about in the Oval Office, about exactly where the money is going to come from this. Again, if the Europeans had money to buy American or any other weapons to send to Ukraine over the past 3.5 years, they would have done it already, because they've been chafing at the bit. The political will is there, and that's a matter of public record. We don't know about the details. We don't know about the nature of the weapons. And look, we've gone through one wonder weapon after another. It was javelins first. It was the ATACMS and HIMARS later. Then it was the F-16s. All of those weapons have arrived. Everyone expected them to change the course of the battle, and they've all failed to do so. Even if the United States provides Ukraine with a limited amount of missiles, let's say, that can strike deeper rather than less deep into Russian territory, I seriously doubt, looking at the battlefield in Ukraine, that that will make a fundamental change to the dynamics on the battlefield.
Good question here, of course. Ruslan, do people in Ukraine expect, the change of heart of Trump and also his continued supply of weapons to Ukraine through NATO will become a game changer on the battlefield?
I don't think so. Ukrainian people are still very realistic in this situation, and no one weapon or weapon supplies from Ukrainian side could change significantly the battlefield, of course, situation. But it gives the new supplies gives Ukraine more time, and of course, if we are comparing the resources of Ukraine with Russia, this comparison is not for Ukrainian side. But we need to understand this. We don't have just a Ukrainian-Russian war. We have a very internationalized conflict, and behind the Ukraine, behind the Russia, there is a group of allies which are supporting each of sides. And we counted that more than 80 countries in the world are taking part in this conflict, not in strictly way, but they are sending supplies, military, they are supporting very active one of the side. So we have very internationalized conflict, and only Ukrainian or only Russian resources maybe doesn't matter so much if we are not taking into account all resources of their allies. Ukraine used our own resources in 2022, but we continue in our war on the resources of our allies, except of demographical resources, which is still on Ukrainian side. Of course, no one believes in the significant change in the battlefield, but that it gives time for Ukraine, and there is a small hope that during this time something will happen inside of Russia, inside of allies around of Russia, maybe, and many of Ukrainian commentators are saying that maybe United States and Trump will broke relations with Putin at all, and maybe Trump will be back to the conflict, like maybe Trump will take the shoes of the Biden administration in this situation, so it could leverage the Ukrainian chances and the Russian chances in this war. Of course, me personally, I'm supporter of the peace resolution. I don't believe that there is a military decision in this conflict. But I'm sure that without the straight participation of United States in peace negotiation, Ukraine and Russia are not able to find the solutions. The level of distrust between the sides, the long term of conflict, more than 10 years we have such a conflict. This conflict, it doesn't let the sides to find the solution in this war. So the most possible scenario for nowadays is continuation of the war with some episodical escalations, and long-range weapon of United States could make a symbolic damage for Russia. For example, if Ukraine will use it against Moscow or another big or symbolic Russian places. But at the same time, we will see a negotiation process. And if United States will be out of this process, this negotiation process will not be also successful. It could be only a diplomatic play, during which both sides will try to show how they will in the peace, but at the same time they will be fighting as much as they can.
That's true. Zhou Bo, some say, in a certain sense, Trump was a promise to continue to supply Ukraine with weapons, make him basically a Biden administration 2.0, and that's a continuation of the policy of the previous government. And people said that's not going to make any difference probably in the battlefield within the time range of 50 days, especially.
Well, I think you're probably right because Trump certainly wished to strike a difference from Joe Biden, and he would love to have a Nobel Peace Prize. But look at what happened in the Middle East, right? He eventually changed his mind and he ordered the bombing of B-2 on Iran's nuclear facilities. So this kind of temptation really depends on the situation, and it also depends on timing. And because he's so frustrated with his negotiation, which isn't making any progress, so I believe the easiest thing for such an unpredictable president is to change his mind. Yeah, because if he failed in this regard, he has to try the other means. So I just believe he's just trying, but the consequences are what are the end game, right? With this kind of a war going on, escalating bit by bit, could we eventually come to the most unimaginable situation that is a nuclear war? Yeah, because this was what Russia warned right from beginning, which has really worked. It has deterred, the the NATO soldiers from being involved in the war. But with this kind of continuation going on, right now I don't believe Russia would like to do that because it is to have an upper hand. But with the massive support from both NATO, Europe, and the United States, so things are just becoming unpredictable. And this worries everybody, right?
But what about this threat of like 100% tariffs on countries like China and India doing business with Russia?
Well, I think it would have, first of all, it depends on how serious Trump is, right? Because it will just have an impact on probably 10 countries most, starting from China and India, who would buy up to 85 to 90% of seaborne oil, crude oil, yeah, from Russia. And then the UAE is also the center for this kind of trading. Yeah, and then we have Vietnam and Thailand who have gas and oil and even defense connection with Russia. So we'll wait and see. But when it comes to China, remember the lesson we have already learned. China did not wink, yeah, in front of Trump's threat before. It is Trump who has winked. So this kind of things, we will have to wait and see.
Anton, how do you look at the role to be played by the Europeans? So they are the party which will foot the bill.
They are the party that will foot the bill, and there are very serious discussions in Europe. They've been going on for many months now about where to get the money. The EU wants to float for the first time in its history essentially bonds that will raise money directly for the EU government. In other words, for Ursula von der Leyen, for the Commission. That has been blocked by several countries. Now, there's another way to raise this money, which of course is through NATO members. NATO itself, by the way, does not have any money. NATO is simply a bureaucracy based in Brussels. It's its members that provide the money, and it's its members that will be forking the money out to buy these weapons from the United States. Now, several countries have already come out and publicly said, literally within the past, 36 hours, that they will not be participating in this. And they include France, Italy, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. There'll probably be a few more. Other countries have stepped forward and said that they will participate in this. But it all comes back to the issue, Tyndall, of the why they would need this announcement to have purchased weapons from the United States or from any other market before. They had the money, they had the will, and they did not do it. So, although from a distance, this announcement looks very good for Ukraine, and all the appropriate quarters have been portraying it as such over the past 36, 48 hours, the closer you get to the actual promises, to the words, once you start parsing the language, the picture begins to dissolve into a million details that have not been settled. One of which is where would the money come from? But again, strategically, it looks to me like the Trump administration is actually extricating itself from the war in Ukraine and basically becoming an arms supplier. Which, again, as Ruslan, I think, mentioned just a few minutes ago, this is nothing personal, strictly business. This is the United States making money on a war that the Ukrainians will be fighting and dying in, and the Europeans will be paying for. And this in itself is an interesting reversal, because Europe's initial position in this war is that the Ukrainians and the Russians will be fighting, the Americans will be paying for it, and the Europeans will be supplying some of the weapons, but staying out of it. That is no longer the case. So we'll see how this turns out, including with the sanctions. And just to add very quickly to what Zhou Bo just said, secondary sanctions on Russia really mean sanctions on China and India and Brazil and everyone else who is buying Russian energy, which incidentally includes Europeans. They bought more energy from Russia last year than they contributed money to the European war effort. And it also actually includes the United States, which continues to buy uranium from Russia. And if the Americans start making exceptions to these sanctions for themselves and their allies, and yet applying them to China, India, and everyone else who is not a member of NATO, then this is the biggest gift to the expansion of BRICS Plus than the BRICS can possibly imagine.
Well, Ruslan, of course, inside Ukraine, President Zelensky said, he had a very good conversation with Trump, and that the pair had agreed to catch up more often by phone. Obviously, the president is happy with the announcement by Trump. And also, he's basically looking at a major cabinet reshuffle with a possible new prime minister and a defense minister. What is behind this cabinet reshuffle? How does it relate to the situation in the battlefield?
I don't think that it will be a significant influence on the battlefield, but there are a few political reasons for this reshuffle of Ukrainian government. The first reason that the previous government was extremely unpopular in Ukrainian society. More than half of Ukrainians, more than 50% of Ukrainians don't trust this government. And of course, so high anti-ratings are making a huge influence on the reputation on person of president of Ukraine. So they need to put out some steam from this kettle, from this political kettle, because we don't have long time for election in Ukraine. We don't have some significant changes in the government, but at the same time, situation is inside the country a very crisis situation. We have a very pessimistic public opinion now in Ukraine. And the second reason, very important also, so it means that new faces in the government maybe will grow up the level of the trust towards the power in Ukraine. The second reason is also very important and depends on the figure of a new prime minister of Ukraine, Yulia Sviridenko. Yulia Sviridenko is a very significant person who signed the agreement, minimal agreement with the United States. So this reshuffle of Ukrainian government is also an attempt to restart the negotiations, the relations with the United States, with the new administration inside of United States. And the third reason is many ministers lost the trust in the eyes of the president, and many chairs in the government were almost empty, and some technical issues should be also resolved.
Well, of course, inside the U.S., Trump is also dealing with the criticism of continuing with the continuous supply of weapons to Ukraine from his MAGA base. With that, we are coming to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.